James asked the question, do we run from the bear because we're afraid, or are we afraid because we run? Mm-hmm. And Darwin had said that fear is this innate thing that we've inherited from animals, this innate mental state, and that is the cause of why we would run from a bear. And in general, everybody in this room probably believes that we run from danger because we're afraid.
Yeah.
But the research that I've done and the theories that I've developed suggest that this correlation that we think we have between we're afraid and we're running from the bear is simply that, a correlation. It's not fear that causes us to run away.
Welcome to Sing for Science. I'm your host, Matt White. Today, I'm joined by musicians Ali and AJ and neuroscientist Dr. Joseph LeDoux. Ali and AJ have a song about anxiety disorders called Attack of Panic, and Joseph is the author of the 2015 book, Anxious, Using the Brain to Understand and Treat Fear and Anxiety. Needless to say, I don't think we could have made a better match with you folks.
I don't think so.
Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining us. Perhaps the best way to start, because your song ties into this show concept so perfectly, is just to talk for a bit about why you wrote the song and why you're interested in being here and talking to Joseph and mental health awareness and all the things that come with it.
Well, AJ and I always kind of keep a list of either song titles or song ideas when they, happen to come upon us. And with this song specifically, I happened to be in Italy with a friend of ours whose father is Italian. He speaks English, but it's, slightly broken English. And he was talking about how we were on the subject matter of how later in life he started having these, and he was calling them attacks of panic. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way to say that. And I was like, I think he's meaning like an anxiety attack. And I didn't really correct him. I just kind of listened to his story, and it was really interesting. And I was like, okay, I'm going to just write that down, attack of panic. And then I just showed it to AJ, and I was like, this is a weird idea maybe, but I think this is kind of a cool song title.
I think for Ali and I, it became really personal, not only that title, but the idea of a panic attack and how much it's affected Ali and I in the past. I mean, we've both suffered with depression and anxiety for really as long as I can remember. It's crazy because I have so many questions that I want to ask about, is it hereditary, knowing that it stemmed from our mom and our grandparents and seeing how it's kind of made its way down the line to us. But I think being in such a high octane industry, being musicians, being actors, it has caused for a lot of added stress that I'm not sure would exist if we weren't doing this. And it's what we love, but it also comes with this kind of price to pay a little bit, which I feel like can cause this anxiety in me that is
debilitating.
It can be debilitating, and sometimes you just get up and you go and you roll with your day, but other times it can be severe and it can be a panic attack. And that's why this song felt like not only an interesting connect with who Ali was with in Italy, but with ourselves. So
can you talk about those lyrics in the first verse and the chorus about what it's like experiencing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that opening line is really key because it's that idea of I'm picturing myself in a bathroom, right? Laying on the cold floor, sit back, relax, everything attacks. It's coming, you're going to have to sit back and buckle up for the ride. And you're not saying you're going to relax into a panic attack. You're saying this is what I wish I could do, but instead it's all going to come on full force. So that first verse, I think, opens up the idea of what I'm about to feel, I'm just going to have to embrace because I know I can't stop it at this point. I think I remember feeling like when having a panic attack, my whole body felt like I was just I had to just be in bed the rest of the day. I was exhausted mentally, I was exhausted physically. Your legs don't work the same. You feel wobbly, you feel shaky. And the only way that it's going to leave is to keep breathing. So you will get through it. It will pass. Yeah. You're not going to die.
It's just a moment. Yeah.
So you are pretty well informed about how to...
I guess we are.
I guess. Yeah. Or we are more informed when we write a song about it than if I could just speak about it to someone. Funny enough. But
yeah, that's probably true.
This occurred to me, Joseph. You mentioned this very almost counterintuitive sounding thing, which is that, I'm experiencing fear because I'm having this physiological phenomenon happening, right?
Well, that would be one component, but it wouldn't be a defining component. So that was the William James point, if you want to go back to that. When James said we aren't afraid because that we're afraid because we run, what he was saying is that body signals in the act of responding to danger create signals that the brain interprets as fear, because each emotion, he said, had a distinct body signature. And that has been very difficult to prove scientifically. So I don't think that's widely accepted. But he was correct that we don't run from the bear because we're afraid. That fear is the conscious assembly of that experience, that narration that is part of your life. Everything we do, we're narrating. That little voice in your head is always narrating stuff.
Right.
Try to go to sleep at night and you can't shut the damn thing off.
You're right.
It's true.
So I'm curious, as someone who's had several panic attacks, as it's laid out by someone who's studied it in depth, and there are all these different components to it, because it's such an all-consuming experience, which is very unpleasant. Is it illuminating? Does it feel like it minimizes it? I just feel like if I had a real traumatizing psychological event and I was learning that this was the process of, very ancient system that was in place and not really rooted in the reality of my experience, perhaps, I don't know how I'd react. So I'm curious as to how you process that. I don't know if this is new information to you, what Joseph is saying, but
most of it is.
Totally is.
Can I clarify something?
Yeah,
then?
please.
Yeah.
So, I think it's not necessarily all being determined by that ancient system. That ancient system is generating a lot of stuff, like the suffocation feeling, the tension in your heart, and all of the cold and hot sweats and all of these things that you're experiencing. But ultimately, if you didn't have your conscious mind, you wouldn't know that that's happening to you. These would just be body states that would be part of your life.
Right.
So it's the conscious awareness that this is happening to you, which is perhaps a unique feature of the human brain. We've got, we're always hearing about how similar our brains to other animals. But we have a place up here in the frontal lobe called the lateral frontal pole. It's the very tip of the frontal cortex. No other animal has that. It has unique cells and unique kinds of physiological properties and chemical properties that not even chimps have.
We're the only ones.
We're the only ones that so far that anyone has been able to identify. It's a unique thing.
What's it called?
The frontal pole.
Frontal pole.
So, and you think, well, people get all upset when you say, well, chimps don't have that. But, we don't look like chimps. We have a lot of things that are different. No one would mistake a chimp for a human walking down the street. So they're just differences. It doesn't make us better. I mean, in fact, all this ability to conceptualize and to understand is the source of all our problems.
I was just
going to
say, it almost makes things worse because it complicates everything.
It does.
Right.
Instead of just living in a life without...
Responsible for narcissism,
Yes.
greed, envy, all of the awful things. Also, it allows us to conceptualize things and, decide, okay, I'm going to build an Empire State Building.
I was going to say, or to
I'm
dream.
going to write a song.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's the yin and yang. It's our good and bad.
I want to get back to my question to you.
Absolutely.
About because I think
How this illuminates everything for me a little bit.
Well, that, and also I think it would be in the interests of helping mental health awareness for people to have some access to the science of, and by science I mean like the evidence of what people like Joseph have studied and what we do know. And I think that's really important to help kind of bridge that gap of what's a very like isolated experience of having problems with mental health, and then
you feel like you're the only one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because you were also like curious about how you could maybe better explain
a panic attack to someone else.
Yeah, the process of going through one, because I think some people don't really understand it at all if they've never had one.
True.
So in 1996, I wrote a book called The Emotional Brain, and I was very surprised that I kept getting, email was new then, but we had email, and I'd get emails or letters from therapists saying that the patients were really enjoying reading about the amygdala and how it's controlling all these body responses, so that they could conceptualize that it's not them. They're not a bad person. They're not. It's not their fault that they're having like oversensitivity to things and so forth. So I think that the patients do appreciate knowing a bit about the science and seeing how it all works. I mean, what's your take?
Very much so. I mean, I feel like for me, it takes some of the quote unquote fear out of it a little bit. Talking about it normalizes it for me. I mean, I've never really discussed this publicly. I hope that it's illuminating for other people who are listening, but I also feel like when it does happen, you do have this like out of body experience where you feel like you are the only one. This is never going to end. Could I die? Like I remember feeling that when I first had it for the first time.
I mean, anxiety is something that everybody has. It's not unusual. And growing up in a high pressure situation that you guys were under, being children and, doing all the things you were expected to do at a young age, it's probably not too surprising. I mean, what's the incidence of anxiety and depression in young actors? And you were actors as children, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, the pressure of having to show up a certain way on set every day and stay consistent, whether
that's a big job for a kid.
It's a big job for a kid. Yeah. I mean, you're on a show at 11, 12 years old.
You're memorizing lines. You're getting up at 6 a.m. I mean,
yeah, there's a schedule to it. There's a professionalism that has to be brought to set every day. You don't really want to fail anyone. You don't want to really show that you're anxious because it shows that there's a personality shift when you show up on set. And then people are like, why is she acting different? She's usually very cheery and bubbly.
Yeah.
That's my thing, is that I have a big personality and a lot of joy. And so when I am off, people really tend to notice it. And so there's this idea that I have to be very consistent all the time. And it's like, if AJ's acting a little bit down or a little bit off, it's like, what happened to AJ's big bubbly personality?
Oh, yeah. So that's why I don't even,
Allie's like, no.
I'm just like a monotone level at all times. So then nobody.
You're not.
No, I'm not.
But I think on set, it was this idea of like, I would feel the pressure of like having to know my lines, wanting to do a great job as an actor, wanting to be a people pleaser. And that ended up turning into this anxiety that felt a little bit hard to manage. And then later in life, I did experience panic attacks for like a year. I probably had 3 or 4. I haven't had one in a long time, but I remember that feeling. The weird thing is, a lot of what I kind of recall seems fuzzy. And I wonder if that's because your brain kind of shuts it out. I don't know if there's I don't know if as people, I think we have the ability to shut out trauma, right? So if that was a traumatic moment in my life, I'm sure my brain has kind of wanted to like recalibrate.
Well, there's actually, a good scientific explanation for why you might not remember stuff, or why you might even remember it stronger, depending on your particular makeup. And that is that in a stressful situation, things, hormones like cortisol are released, and these are actually very toxic at high levels. So if you're very stressed out and cortisol is just flowing like crazy into your brain, then it can go to the part of the brain that's heavily involved in memory, which is called the hippocampus, and have a toxic effect there. It can shut it down, so that your ability to store that information that's happening to you at the moment is impaired. Now, there's probably some adaptive value to that, that you don't have to carry it all with you the rest of your life.
Right, like a survival instinct. Almost.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it's important to benefit from the past, and so you do want to remember what happened to you. And I guess the other thing to point out is that there are different kinds of memories that are formed in a situation like that. So the hippocampus is involved in forming a cognitive memory so that you can remember what you were doing, who you were with, what it was all about. But other parts of the brain are storing information implicitly or unconsciously, like the part of the brain that I work on called the amygdala is storing information about the threat and the danger and the situation you're in, and forming associations with all of the things that are happening. So when you encounter those cues later in life, they can go into your brain, remind you of what you were doing, who you were with, and so forth through the hippocampus, but through your amygdala cause you to begin to, your heart to race, your palms to sweat, you feel out of breath and so forth. And those are cues that you associate with a panic attack from having had one. And because, even if it's not that big a threatening situation, if you're not that bad, those cues can remind your amygdala that was associated with it, and so you start to have the symptoms, and they just sort of rev up and can rev up into a panic attack.
That's interesting.
So, but during the formation of that memory, if the cortisol is very high, then you won't necessarily remember all of the details. But it's a kind of double-edged sword, because before you lose that capacity, your hippocampus is forming memories even stronger because of the cortisol. So, but then at some point you may lose it. Then later, because you've formed an incomplete memory, you might go to therapy and try to, retrieve all this stuff.
Right.
And you don't have the information, you have bits and pieces, and you try to put it together. And that's where the possibility of false memory comes from, which is that you have bits and pieces and you put it together into a narrative that makes sense, but may not be accurate in terms of what happened. All memory is, all
That's
memory
how it feels for
is
me.
by nature a reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore,
It's not a
false
carbon
memory.
copy. Every memory is a false memory in that sense. Usually it's not so false,
Right,
so
right.
it's okay. But it's always a kind of, putting back together on the basis of incomplete information.
It's so fascinating.
Is it that it's partially recording it, or you only have partial access to it?
Well, that's a good question. And scientifically, that's a really hard question to parse. Because all you know is that the memory is not as good as it was. And to say it's because it wasn't stored properly, or that it was stored properly, but you can't pull it out, you can't retrieve it, is just very difficult to know.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's enlightening because I've never really spoken to someone like you about this. I mean, yes, you can continue to take medication, right? Anti-anxiety medication, and see a psychologist and continue to kind of review the typical monthly updates so that you continue to get medication, right? But I also feel like I'm a little scared that being on something long term is not healthy.
Unfortunately, we don't know.
We don't
We don't know.
Yes,
And that's kind of what's scary. And it's interesting. I've had this conversation with friends where they're like, how do you feel continuing to stay on this?
Right.
And I'm like, well, I don't know. It hasn't done me any harm yet. But are there other ways to treat anxiety outside of antidepressants that might be a lot healthier long term?
Right. So, I mean, my perspective is that, part of the problem is that all of the major treatment approaches today, or the most popular ones, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy and drug therapy, are both outcomes of behaviorism in psychology. In other words, behaviorism got rid of the mind. It said all we need to understand is stimuli and responses. And for decades...
Can we talk about what stimuli and responses are?
Sure. So if you want to understand, for example, why a person does X, according to this logic, you would need to know what the stimuli are, what are the environmental components that are making you do that, and what is it that you're doing. And so if you're over-responding to threats, then according to behaviorism, you can explain that as a history of relationship between threats and your behavior.
Right.
You don't need anything inside the head. You don't need any conscious experience. You don't need any brain or anything to account for that. So that led to, for example, behavior therapy, which is the first kind of non-Freudian therapy, that would use things like the procedure called extinction, or exposure. You repeat the stimulus over and over again to weaken the threat potential of it. So if you're afraid of spiders, you make the person sit there with the spider over and over again. So that's the origin of exposure therapy, but then cognitive behavior therapy added more cognition to it. But the cognition was all in the service of behavior. And drugs, of course, are all about behavior. You take rats or mice, put them in challenging situations, give them a medication, and if they act less timid, you assume that they're less fearful or anxious, and therefore when you give it to a person, that person will be less fearful or anxious. Now, the things you're describing in terms of medications, I think are not, let's just ask the question, how could you possibly change the content of someone's experience with a chemical?
Right.
I don't think you can do that. What you can do is turn down the volume.
Yes. That's
So-
a very good way to word it.
You go into a restaurant in New York, it's too loud.
Yep.
Somebody
You're
says,
overwhelmed.
turn it down. They turn it down. The song is the same. It was just not as irritating.
It's background noise instead of like
Right.
front and center.
Right.
And that's what the medications are doing.
Yeah.
But so they're not going into a fear or anxiety center. They're just adjusting things so that consciously you can tolerate
It's not
it better.
eliminating it from your life, which
Right. I mean, if you're an anxious person, you're going to be anxious the rest of your life. But you
Totally.
can learn how to cope with it.
yes.
Totally.
But if a drug is sold as an anti-anxiety drug, and it's not changing anxiety itself per se, but turning down the volume, then it's being missold. And the companies have stopped funding efforts to develop new medications because they can't find anything that works.
That
Since the
eliminates it
60s, you've
completely.
got reuptake inhibitors and benzodiazepines. So what do you find? You find new reuptake inhibitors and new benzodiazepines because all of the tests are developed because they are effective with those drugs. So all you do is you find more of those. So they say, well, we're not finding anything, so we're getting out of the business. But really, they shouldn't be getting out of the business because the drugs help. They're just not anti-anxiety. They're
not targeting that,
anti-symptom,
Yeah.
behavioral and
Right.
physiological symptom medications. That sounds less sexy, but it's more accurate. And I think patients would be more appreciative if they got accurate information.
Yes.
I'll tell you what
100%.
is sexy, though, is ketamine and psilocybin. Isn't that where things are headed?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a movement in that direction.
I've read that too.
For panic?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the other direction that, and I'll get back to that, but the other direction, of course, is mindfulness and your ability that is directly addressing your conscious states, right? Your experience. And I think we do have to address experience. But perhaps one thing that we need to understand is that we need to first tone down the amygdala with, for example, medication or exposure. Secondly, we then need to begin to change the hippocampus where we have these conscious memories. And at that point, if you do those things in that sequence, the brain is now prepared to do talk therapy, to do meditation, and to use the mind to help itself. But if you're, while you're trying to meditate, you're being aroused and you're hyper, just like you can't slow down, you can't get your breathing slow enough because you're always thinking about, as soon as you go into a meditative moment, you all of a sudden start to have these anxious thoughts. So you need to calm down the machine a bit.
It's like you need to set up prior to
Right. It's got to be
accessing
set up
that
properly.
part of your mind.
Right. That's why I've studied TM briefly, and it's interesting because there's a way that you have to enter TM, right? For
TM is
2-3 minutes.
transcendental meditation.
That's right. Thank you. There's that kind of 2 minutes, 3 minutes of getting into it so that you're not racing as your brain is not racing as you're trying to get into the transcendental state. But then exiting it too is really important. I have a question about fear and anxiety. Why do some people seem to be activated by it, like an athlete per se, but then other people are debilitated by it? Because I feel like some people thrive off fear and anxiety, right? It can help them. It can benefit them. They can probably become a better athlete for it.
So there's a famous description of how all this works, and it's relevant to other things we talked about. It's called the inverted U curve. So a little bit of anxiety or arousal or stress is moving you. Let's say this is on this curve on the bottom is how much stress there is, and up here on this side is the performance. So as you increase stress, you perform well. But if you go too far with stress, you cross over.
dip
And
down.
everyone has a different tipping point on that.
Interesting.
So some people will tip very early as the stress builds up. Others can take it for a long time. And if you can take it and use it, then you'd have to have some kind of interest, arousal, anxiety, worry to succeed in life.
That's just probably person to person then in that instance.
And how much they can handle.
Right. But we all need some motivation to
Yeah.
do
Correct.
something, So if you gotta focus on it, and if people who are focused, you might say, well, they're anxious about it, but they're just kind of getting into it, and you need a little bit of arousal.
Yeah. Or somebody's challenging you to rise to the occasion. And it's like for me, for instance, I want to prove that person wrong. So then I'm like on like a manhunt to like be like, I'm okay. And now it's really happening, because you're doubting me.
And then you reach your tipping point and it becomes...
Right. And then there's probably some people that if they got that type of feedback, they would just give up, So I guess it's very personal then.
So, I think you do need to be aroused to some extent. If you're just totally lethargic, you're not going to be creative and useful to the projects you're working on.
Yeah.
So you need to be a little revved up. But if you go too far, then you get maybe, grouchy and not a good team player.
What do you think? This is slightly off subject, but it's still in our world of mind. Are there like things you can actually do to prepare yourself to like keep your mind open to creativity?
Well, I think, just starting with a little bit of standard breathing and relaxation approaches, maybe 5 minutes of meditation.
Yeah.
Just to get everybody calmed down on the same level. I mean, I'm not a meditation expert. I do work with someone to try and build it more into my life, and I find it very useful. So I think, if you just walk in off the street and say, okay, let's create, maybe that can work sometimes, but maybe sometimes you need to be on the same page. And also, I mean, when I write songs, I can't walk into a room and say, okay, today is the day I'm going to write a song.
Yes.
I'm impressed you guys can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to mention Joseph is also a songwriter, musician, and I was going to piggyback on Allie's question. How the intersection of your work and your research, how is that applied to your creative pursuits?
Yeah, so I mean, I write songs about mind and brain and mental disorders, so it kind of the science gives material to the creative process. But I'm kind of running out of song titles that I can put the word mind into. So I probably have 30 or so.
But in terms of strategy,
We can send you some after this. We got you.
Okay.
in terms of strategy, though, like what Allie was asking, have you used that to inform your process?
People ask me all the time, do you use your research to guide your life? And it's hard to do. It's like I'm too close to the research. And, I guess to the extent that I try to use meditation, I'm not using my research, but I'm benefiting from the field in that sense. And I guess I know a lot about, for example, what breathing does is it grabs your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite of the sympathetic. And the sympathetic nervous system is the classic fight-flight system. So that's what's, causing your heart to race and your palms to sweat and everything to be kind of revved up in charge. The parasympathetic is the opposite, so it's going to slow that system down. When you do the meditative kind of breathing, that entrains the parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, it grabs it and forces the sympathetic to slow down. So that's why breathing is really useful. But scientifically, it just puts the body's nervous system into a state which is more compatible with the meditative moment.
Which is true, because I've sometimes even going into an audition, I mean, I don't really get that nervous anymore, but every once in a while I'll find myself where I'm like, my heart's beating a little fast. Like, I know I'm going to go in the next 5 minutes.
And it can
like,
really take away from your performance.
Oh, totally.
So you have to ground yourself before you go in.
So there's many times that I've tried to remind myself, I need to just like close my eyes right now. I need to take deep breaths for the next couple minutes before I go in the room. And it really does calm you down. It's wild.
Are you a fan of guided meditation? What kind of meditation are you most inclined to do before
guided is good, and there's so many on the internet you can find. And there's this thing called Insight Timer that has all these guided meditations for sleep, for anxiety, for depression, whatever you want a guided meditation for. They're there.
That's cool. Insight
Timer.
It's got custom bell sounds and everything.
Oh yeah.
Oh, cool.
Music
Bells and whistles.
I need that.
You should dive into meditation more.
I don't do it nearly enough. I mean, I go to yoga and it'll be like, we're meditating the last 5, and I'm just like closing my eyes, like
Just shavasana.
deep breathing, going like, shit, that was hard. I mean, I'm like barely like, I don't know if I'm really meditating right now, but I'm vibing. But I know that like it works, and so many of my friends do it. And AJ, I mean, I know you believe in it. I don't practice it nearly enough.
I don't either.
I mean, I've been told that 5 minutes a day is enough to kind of really start you and get you going. And to have a thought that you repeat with the breath going out and the breath coming in, it's kind of like you follow your breath and just lock into it for 5 minutes, and then you feel much better.
Do you feel like it's the pattern of breathing in and out, or the actual oxygen?
I think it's like, I think a 6-second cycle of the breath is best for locking in the parasympathetic nervous system. So 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. A little pause between.
Cool.
So it is the oxygen? Is it the intake, the chemical?
Well,
that is kind of lining you up.
Related to panic, one of the problems in panic is you have excess carbon dioxide. So you have this kind of suffocation. So I think when you're the whole point of respiration is to move the carbon dioxide out. And if it's building up, then you're not doing it. So this is like doing it on a regular basis, which not only gets the carbon dioxide out, but it entrains your heart. to be working in conjunction with the respiratory system.
So this kind of taps into the bear and running thought insofar as the
physiology.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So William James said this: each emotion has its own physiology, but the more commonly accepted idea is that the body physiology can be a signal, but it's pretty blunt. It's not very precise. So there's not a unique signature for fear and anger and love and whatever. But if you're in a state where your heart is beating fast, that informs your cognitive system that you need to generate a narrative, an interpretation of why that's happening. If it's because you just, ran a 100-yard dash, you got an explanation.
Right.
If it's because you're about to go on stage, you probably have an explanation, but it may be disappointing. You don't want that. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a way, again, AJ and I don't really get nervous for going on stage for shows.
No.
But there's definitely not a sense of dullness right before we go on. There's an energy that's kind of reacting in our system and our stomach, that's getting you kind of ready to go up on stage.
Yeah, so you're on that good point of the inverted U at that point.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
Exactly. You haven't hit your tipping point. You're actually feeling like it can inform your performance.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you were just going out on stage bored, it'd be a horrible show. Right. What are 3 books in regards to mental health that would be smart
besides
for us to
your
add?
own?
Besides yours, to add to a book list.
That's a tough question. Dan Levitin, who's a musician, lives in L.A. actually. He wrote a book called "This Is Your Brain on Music." That was a very popular book. A lot of musicians love it. But he also wrote a book called The Organized Mind. And it's not about mental health so much, but just about, how to organize your daily routines and how to use your mind in productive ways. So I think that would be...
I could use that.
I could really use that.
Sometimes, it is weird. Your day just gets lost. And you're like, how the F did this happen? And it's really strange. And I'm a quite productive person. I have my lists. I have my to-do. It's I love sleep, so maybe I sleep a little too long.
But time management is
can be bizarre.
You get over that as you get older.
Yeah, you're like that will stop when children also get involved. I get 9 hours of sleep every day. Other than maybe when I'm on set, but I try to get 9 because if I get 6 or 7, I feel like I need to take a nap on set.
Well, but that's also...
You run off of way less sleep. I don't know how you do it.
I can, but I
force myself to go to bed at 9 o'clock if I have a crazy early call time.
I like getting more hours, but when I'm working on set, it's really hard to wind down because you're ramped up from being on set for 12 hours. So usually you're not getting to bed till 10 or 11, and then you're up at 4 a.m. So I don't get a lot of sleep. But it might be the reason why you don't feel like you're getting a ton of sleep, even though you are, is because you're not entering proper REM, which is interesting because I'm actually going to take a sleep test and see how much of my sleep is actually productive. Because I probably shouldn't need as much as I feel like I need, if that makes sense. So that's another discussion. But
that's with a sleep doctor.
I wanted to take a moment and encourage you, Allie, to enter into a world and field of sleep advocacy. I don't know, maybe we're past this era where everyone was pushing the work hard, play hard ethos, and it's I only need 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, people say that, and I'm like, what?
No.
And it's really important that people realize that a life well lived is filled with relaxation and reflection.
Yeah.
So get out there and stump for sleep.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful.
Of course, everybody needs a different amount.
That's what I'm going to run on for this next election is more sleep.
Her mission can be called 9 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
I really think that there is something to be said about how much that can just not only inform your health, physical health, but your mental health when there's sleep involved.
Honestly,
in your life.
sleep and food. There's such
But it's true. So many people don't
things.
feel productive if they say, I got a lot of sleep. It's like people are embarrassed to admit that.
Okay.
Yeah,
you're totally
issue
right.
entirely.
It's like there's a shaming behind it.
Yeah.
How did you get into this line of work specifically? Was it just a passion of yours at a young age?
No. I have no, it's kind of crazy, but I have no training as a scientist. 0 courses, and I flunked math in high school and did the same in college and never took any science courses.
You're kidding.
No.
Science was never a great subject matter for me myself.
So I studied business in college, business administration. And just because I grew up in a small town, my parents said, go to college and learn to be a businessman and come back to town. So I did that, and I didn't go back to town, but I studied business and got a master's in marketing, and in the process started getting interested in consumer psychology. Why do people buy stuff?
What year was this?
Late 60s, early 70s.
So was there any coincidence with what Ralph Nader was doing?
I was a Nader's Raider kind of guy.
What's a Nader's Raider?
He had all these young people that were trying to argue for consumer protection to help consumers be better consumers and not be swayed by advertising so much.
You were a champion of him.
That's cool.
So I worked on that, and in the process got more and more involved in psychology, and took a course with the guy studying the brain. I said, "Well, I didn't know you could do that," and I said, "I want to do that." And I applied to graduate school and happened to get in because this guy knew somebody at that place, and just started to change my career right there with no science background. There was no neuroscience to speak of at the time. There was no field. The field began right around early 70s. I didn't need to know a lot to study these split brain patients, left, right, front, back. Put a stimulus over here, goes to the right hemisphere. So it was very simple. Had a slow intro to it. And then after that, I spent 12 years at a neurobiology lab uptown at Cornell Medical School. And that's where I got all my training. I spent, learning neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. It was all on-the-job training. And that's why I think it worked well, because it wasn't book learning. It was just practical stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Then I always had my guitar to calm me down.
Oh, good.
Oh, it's a good mix.
So I actually want to take a moment there to ask, what is the current understanding of what neurotransmitter does what? And I could be wrong, but I get the feeling that it's just constantly being refreshed.
Well, I think we have to move away from the idea that chemicals are the answer. They are in some sense, but the same chemical, let's take a chemical like a benzodiazepine. How does that work? Well, it works by interacting with something called the GABA receptor. Now, GABA is the main inhibitory transmitter in the brain. So this is a chemical that when it's turned on, it's a neuron that's turned on, it causes inhibition. In other words, it shuts down all the excitatory activity. So instead of the brain being active, it's less active. So if you take a benzodiazepine, because GABA receptors are everywhere throughout the brain and body, when you take that drug, it's going to slow everything down. And so it's kind of a blunting of your brain, basically. And that's why it's a little helpful to kind of blunt things, because you're not as edgy. But rather than simply eliminating anxiety, it's probably kind of blunting all emotional.
It's dulling everything.
Yeah. So, chemicals are important, but what's more important is the circuit. In other words, you don't want to just flood the brain with a chemical that's going to do something to the whole brain. We have to find some way to have smart chemicals that can be directed to specific circuits in the brain that do specific things. So, for example, if you want to change threat processing in the brain, you need to find a pill that would, when you take it, somehow only find the amygdala.
Wow.
How could you do that?
That sounds
So,
hard.
here's a possibility. We know a lot about the genes in all these cells now. So let's say you find a gene that is only present in some cells of the amygdala that are involved in threat processing. This is all hypothetical. But then you could take the pill and it would go everywhere, but it would then only affect that cell or those cells because it's key to that gene. So that gene would be the thing that it's finding and binding to.
We can't do this yet,
No,
right?
we could.
Right.
It's not out of the question.
But it's not out of the question in our
Hypothetical
future.
for now.
Yeah, it's certainly, we can do amazing things. For example, there's a technique called optogenetics, which didn't exist 10 years ago. It's revolutionized in the field. It's not something you can do in humans at this point because it's too experimental. But you can inject a virus. Who wants a virus? But it's a dead virus. It's not live. That goes into, you inject it, say, in the amygdala. So the cells in the amygdala will take it up because that virus will, find its way into the cell. And once it's in the cell, it also has these active molecules associated with it that alter the genes processing within the cell. So you can turn genes on and off inside a cell by injecting this drug,
Dead virus,
straight into the brain. So let's say you've got Parkinson's disease, and you need to change dopamine transmission in the caudate putamen of the striatum.
One more time on that one.
So the Parkinson's disease involves dopamine, a chemical often known as the chemical of pleasure, which is total BS. It's not. It's just a side note. But it is involved in Parkinson's disease, and it happens to be important in this part of the brain called the striatum for Parkinson's.
Okay.
So if you need to alter dopamine processing in the striatum, theoretically, you could inject this virus with the dopamine processing components to it to then go in and make more dopamine there, because the problem is the lack of dopamine.
Right.
So
would that work almost for like someone that has diabetes and maybe lacks insulin? I mean, like... Right, yeah.
I mean, the uses are infinite. It's just a matter of, first of all, finding safe ways to put this into the human brain without having to open up the brain and stick an electrode in or a needle in and inject it, because that opens you up to all kinds of infections and so forth.
Right. So
but there might be ways to find ways to through oral ingestion to target structures more specifically with very careful. I mean, it's still science fiction, but
So could we safely say that the goal is to find something that we could ingest that only targets the amygdala?
That would be a cool goal, but that would in itself would be pretty crude, because you need not the amygdala, but the specific threat circuits within the amygdala. Right. That's why the circuit is so important.
Yeah, I saw that you mentioned something about survival circuit.
Right.
Is that is in one of your books?
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is exactly?
Sure. So, rather than calling the amygdala a fear circuit, I call it a defensive survival circuit. It's a circuit that we've inherited from animals that detects danger and produces protective responses, defensive responses, like freezing or fleeing, that allows us to survive an encounter. That circuit in this book, The Deep History of Our Cells, I trace back to the beginning of life. Not because the first bacterial cells that ever lived had cells and circuits, because it was only one cell, but because it had to do 5 things to survive: detect danger, incorporate nutrients, balance fluids, thermoregulate, and reproduce. Those are the same things we do every day to survive. So these are survival activities that have been part of cellular life, in other words, part of life, since the beginning of life. As you go from single cells to multiple cell organisms with nervous systems and so forth, things get much more complex. So we have much more complicated ways of defending, incorporating nutrients, balancing fluids, thermoregulating, and reproducing, but it's the same survival need that's being met.
Wow.
And when we do these things, we feel fear and sexual pleasure and hunger and thirst and all these things when these systems are active. But those are our projections onto other organisms. I'm not saying other animals don't have these experiences, but we have no bloody idea what they're experiencing, because their brains are different.
Because they're different, yeah.
So we have to wind things down here. AJ, do you feel cured? This is...
Well, the good thing is I haven't had a panic attack in a long time. So for the last bit, I have felt cured, quote unquote cured.
Okay.
But this actually definitely gives me confidence that it is not abnormal to experience, but also there is no long-lasting damage to this. There is the buildup of false memories, which then you can obviously go back to and kind of reignite this feeling of a panic attack. But I do feel like the best thing I could get out of this interview is the idea of hopefully getting ahead of the panic attack, which I'm not sure is possible, but defeating it before it really sets in, which I think would be the start of like feeling this come on and then meditating ahead of it.
If you could. I mean, that would seem like a tough job, but I think that
seems very
could
tough.
definitely be
It's like
useful.
seeing the tsunami wave.
Which I didn't know when it first all started. So,
right, of course. Well, how could you?
How could you?
Yeah.
So, and this is actually... And you did say we could talk about ketamine and psilocybin,
right,
so I'm going to hold you to that. But I want to, because of...
I know where your head is.
Because of the...
And microdosing.
Yes,
Talk about
all
microdosing.
of it. The date, because of the... And, you had... All the three of you had mentioned that the data is not there for what SSRIs and other mental health drugs. We don't know what the long-term effects are. But one thing that, because I mean, I've gone on and off them for years.
Right.
And one thing that I read that really resonated with me is that neural pathways in some ways could experience atrophy. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that if you're someone that suffers from depression or crippling anxiety, that if you don't treat it, that those neural pathways, that you could experience something like atrophy and you'd actually be doing damage by not taking this medication?
I mean, let's think of it this way. Everything that happens to your brain is registered by your brain in some way. Some kind of neural activity is happening. So life is a series of changes of your brain nonstop. It's just a continuous series of changes. Circuits will change, but as a result of having any kind of condition. Mm-hmm. Whether you're happy all the time, you're building more kind of happiness circuits in a sense, right? Because that's what your brain is kind of going on. Or if you're depressed all the time or in pain all the time, then your circuits are doing more of that. So every experience you have is changing your brain in some way. And whether it's through a medication or just the way you're living your life,
right?
You are changing your brain. And the more positive ways you change it, the better off you'll be. But I'm not sure atrophy is the right word to put in there. Just depression is part of one's life, and everything that's part of one's life changes the brain. Is the way to put it.
Okay.
I hope that people feel comforted by a discussion like this, and feel that the idea of mental health and the debilitating factors are human, and that they don't need to be debilitating for your entire life, that there is a way out of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to write music to kind of ground yourself. But
I mean, even you mentioning that, like, you've gone in and out of dealing with depression, I mean, I think if you talk to most artists, most musicians, they would say, yes, I've struggled with moments, whether it's their whole life or maybe a moment in time where they were getting a divorce or the band was breaking up, or, ticket sales were terrible, or whatever it was. I mean, I'm slightly envious of people who are like, I don't experience depression. I'm always like, wow, really? I'm like, what is that? Mm-hmm. But I guess you can use some of these moments for good if you are able to, like, use that as maybe a superpower in a weird way, to be able to tap into subjects that are hard for people to talk about.
And I think it's another way to identify with other people, though, too. I mean, this was the cool thing about this time that we're living in, is that this is far more socially acceptable to talk about and to talk about publicly.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a fad.
Right.
It can actually be something.
Intellectual discussion like we're all having.
Yeah, we wouldn't have had this conversation, even if we were this age, 15 years ago. No it just wouldn't be nearly as, welcomed with open arms as it is now, which is
never
great.
Talked about it.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you all enough.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks
nice
so much.
Nice meeting
you. You
too. We really
can't wait to
it.
read your book now.
Cool.
That was Attack of Panic with Ali and AJ and Dr. Joseph LeDoux. Check out the latest work from both our guests, including Ali and AJ's track Attack of Panic and Joseph's new book, The Deep History of Ourselves, the 4 billion year story of how we got conscious brains. Special thanks goes out to today's hosts, Song Loft in Brooklyn, New York, Rhett Sword, Otavio Media, TCB Public Relations, and our co-producer, The Talk House. Please be sure to subscribe to Sing for Science and check out our other episodes.